All right, so again, to all of those of you just joining us, welcome to the first of FACNet's 2023 Access and Functional Needs Trainings. We're very excited to have Tess Stanton, the training administrator for the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, here with us today to walk us through the nuts and bolts of the American with Disabilities Act and discuss basic legal obligations related to that act that can help us create more inclusive plans, processes, organizations, and ultimately communities. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box as we go, or take yourself off of mute if you don't want to use the chat. We'll also have some time reserved at the end for a longer period of Q&A and discussion. And with that brief notice, I will hand things over to Tess.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for being here. I'm so excited to be joining you today to talk a little bit more about the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically, and give an ADA overview and talk about basic legal obligations under the ADA, like Tiernan said, just kind of the nuts and bolts of the ADA. My name is Tess Stanton. I'm the training administrator at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, and I'll tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. But just to give an accessible introduction, I am a Caucasian woman with dark brown hair. I have dark brown eyebrows. I'm wearing a black crew neck sweater. I'm sitting in front of a beige wall, and behind me there's a drawing that's framed in a white frame. It's a blue color pencil drawing of several people. And I'm also wearing a headset. So hopefully my sound is nice and reliable for you all today. But if at any point you're unable to see my video or hear me or see my slides, or if you start to see a different view of my slides, please feel free to unmute yourself at any point and interrupt me and let me know. I also have the chat box open. So like Tiernan said, if at any point you have a question, feel free to put that into the chat box and I'll be monitoring that. Or if you're not using the chat box and you're more comfortable unmuting yourself, feel free to do that as well at any time. And we always have to start with this disclaimer that information, materials, and/or technical assistance are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the ADA, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibilities under the ADA. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center, operated by Meeting the Challenge Incorporated, is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR grant number 90 DPA D0009-01-00 to provide technical assistance, training, and materials to Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So really, this is just a lot of words to say that we at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center are not lawyers, so the information we give is not legal advice, but rather should be considered informal guidance. And as promised, a little bit more about who we are and what we do at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. So the Rocky Mountain ADA Center is part of the ADA National Network, and our mission is to provide information on the Americans with Disabilities Act to individuals and organizations throughout Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, or sometimes we're in a situation like this where it's a network of folks, so we get to extend our reach even beyond. But primarily we serve those states, and our center is available to aid individuals seeking to understand their rights under the ADA, as well as organizations and entities that want to know more about their responsibilities. And like I mentioned, we are part of the ADA National Network. So what that is it consists of 10 regional centers that are dispersed throughout the United States. So even though we are designated to Region 8, which is Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, there are ADA centers throughout the entire country. So if you're within the United States and you want to know more about your rights or responsibilities under the ADA and you're outside of our region, you still have a local ADA center you can call for assistance. Or maybe you know someone who's outside of our region, Region 8. Maybe they're in Region 2 or 3 and they want to know more about the ADA. All they have to do is call 1-800-949-4232, and they'll be connected to their local ADA center based on the area code of the phone number that they're calling from. Or You can go online to www.adata.org to find your local ADA center and communicate electronically or submit a question online. And so either option works. But just kind of an overview of what we do at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, and the services across the national network are very similar. So our biggest service is called TA, or technical assistance, and this is a really large part of what we do. So we help interpret the ADA for government officials, employers, small businesses, the list goes on and on. So like I said, you can call us at that phone number, or you can get in touch with us online and just ask a question about the ADA. If an issue arises and you feel like it might have something to do with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or maybe you have a personal situation and you want to know more about what your rights are if you're a person with a disability, you can get in touch with someone and actually kind of work through that situation on a more one-on-one basis. So we know that sometimes the law can be tricky, sometimes the law can have gray area, and that's why we're here. We're here to provide that technical assistance so you can understand your rights, responsibilities, and next steps a little bit better. We also network and we refer. So we are not an enforcement agency. We at the Rocky Mountain ADA centers and the rest of the ADA centers do not enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act, but rather we provide education and informal guidance on it. Now, there are some entities that do enforce the ADA, these being primarily the Department of Justice and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so even though we're not able to intervene and advocate and enforce the ADA, should you need to take it to those next steps of enforcement, we can show you where to go for that. Or if we're just not able to answer your question, we have so many contacts across the country in regards to disability and disability law. And so we can always refer you to those contacts. We also conduct research. So part of our grant funding requires that we do research. So we've done so many studies and we publish those studies on our website, which is rockymountainada.org. We provide training. So exactly what we're doing right now, we provide low-cost training to help groups, get in touch with the ADA and understand more about their rights and responsibilities. We also publish and share materials. So we have an extensive catalog of online courses that are free and self-paced, and they should be available to anyone regardless of location. And you can go on and take those courses and receive a certificate. So if you're looking for more of that individual kind of self-paced learning on ADA topics, those are available on our website, again, rockymountainada.org. We also share materials. So we share fact sheets. We have a blog. We also have a podcast. Again, all of those can be accessed through our website. And then we have social media presence on most major social media platforms. So Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, even TikTok. So if you want to follow along with us, follow along with Disability News, or even get in touch with us on there, you can follow us on social media. So now let's go ahead and jump into today's topic. So our learning objectives today are the following, which will kind of give you a better idea of what you'll walk away with today. We're going to discuss the prevalence of disability and why access matters. We're going to overview the history and purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we're going to discuss basic legal obligations for covered entities under the ADA. We want to make sure that we help you meet your personal objectives. So like I said, please feel free to ask questions at any time. Or if you aren't able to ask a question today, or maybe a question arises after this training takes place, or maybe you have a question that you just would rather ask offline, feel free to get in touch with us. I'll provide our contact information again at the end, and I'll also provide these slides to Tiernan for distribution, so you don't have to memorize all of this information, and you'll also have our contact information there as well. So again, please feel free to connect with us outside of this training should you have a question now, or should one arise in the future after you've kind of had time to digest this information a little bit. So before we dive into, again, the nuts and bolts, I always like to bring in my good friend, Scout the Service Dog, to just kind of give a basic overview of what the ADA is. And this video is linked linked in the slides. Again, that those will be sent out. So should you ever need this video in the future as a resource for yourself or someone else, that is linked, or it's also found through YouTube by searching Rocky Mountain ADA Center. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Scout.
Oh, hello there. Have you heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA? Yeah, the ADA is a law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. This law ensures that people with disabilities are able to fully enjoy all aspects of society. Things such as employment, private business, state and local government organizations, public accommodations and services. The ADA defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or a record of such an impairment. For example, a person who has had cancer but is now cured or in remission, or being regarded as having such an impairment. For example, a person with burn scars who's not impaired in any way, but is discriminated against because someone assumed they were impaired. Major life activities are things that most people can do with little or no difficulty, such as caring for oneself, seeing, hearing, eating, walking, speaking, learning, communicating, and working. Major life activities also include the operation of a major bodily function. These are things like the functions in our organ systems. The ADA's definition of a person with a disability is meant to be broad. Each person is different, and disabilities vary from person to person. Another thing to note is that the ADA still applies even if medication or medical equipment can be used to relieve the effects of a disability. Not all disabilities are alike, and some are more obvious than others. For example, someone who uses a walker or a wheelchair has a visible disability. But there are also disabilities that can be difficult to see, such as asthma, depression, or diabetes. Although these disabilities are not always obvious, they still have a way of limiting daily activities.
Scout, come here, boy.
Whoop, looks like I better go. Thanks for stopping by.
All right, so Scout just kind of gave you the basics, but we'll jump into everything a little more in depth. So starting off with the history. In 1975, Reverend Wade Blank, who was a passionate disability rights advocate, started what was called the Atlantis community in Denver. And Blank found his passion for disability rights while working at a nursing home and promoting efforts to help patients live independent lives. And then on July 5th and 6th, Blank and the Atlantis community held protests in Denver against the wheelchair inaccessibility of public buses. And this was the country's very first demonstration for wheelchair accessible public buses. And at the protests, 19 Atlantis community members, which are called the Gang of 19, blocked the buses with their wheelchairs and chanted, "We will ride." And so then flash forward in 1983, after several years of similar local bus protests and also after inspiring a national movement, the Gang of 19 started ADAPT, or ADAPT. Since the group formed to advocate for wheelchair accessible lifts on buses, ADAPT's name was originally an acronym for Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. And ADAPT's campaign for bus lifts expanded out of Denver to cities nationwide. So like I said, it inspired a national disability rights movement, and adapters became renowned for their strategies of blocking buses to draw attention to the need for wheelchair accessibility. And wheelchair users would stop in front of a bus and in the back of a bus, and others would get out of their chairs and they would crawl up the steps of an inaccessible bus just to make that really great statement that no one could ignore. And after years of protests and lawsuits, bus lifts eventually became required when the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in the year 1990. Adapters then expanded to advocate for disability matters outside of transportation while still ensuring, follow through of transportation provisions in the ADA. So the group later changed its name to Americans Disabled Attendant Programs Today. And then flash forward again to March 12, 1990, to symbolize the barriers confronting disabled people. More than 60 activists abandoned their crutches, wheelchairs, power chairs, and other mobility assistance devices and began actually crawling up these stone steps that lead to the US Capitol building. And Jennifer Keelan, who was an 8-year-old at the time with cerebral palsy, declared, "I'll take all night if I have to." So then we have the ADA, which was signed into law on July 26, 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. The ADA is a civil rights law that affirms the inherent dignity of people with disabilities in America. And as a civil rights law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA as it's usually called, prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, all public and private places that are open to the general public. And the purpose of the law is to make sure that people with disabilities are getting the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. So again, the ADA gives civil rights protections to individuals with disabilities and guarantees equal opportunity in places of public accommodation like grocery stores and retailers, in employment, in transportation, in state and local government services, and telecommunications. The ADA is divided into 5 titles, or you can think of the titles as like sections of the ADA that cover different areas of public life. And something we always like to explain in our trainings is that the ADA is descriptive and not prescriptive. And what we mean by that is that it's not prescriptive and that the ADA does not prescribe exactly what to do in every single situation of discrimination. Everyone experiences disability differently. Every situation is different. So the ADA could not have ever predicted, future instances of discrimination in every case, but rather it's descriptive and that it generally describes what non-discrimination should look like. So in other words, the ADA is not a one size fits all. It very much has to be applied on a case by case basis. And that's why you'll often hear us say the words, "it depends," when you ask a question, because how the ADA applies will very much depend on the situation, the circumstances, the individuals, and also there are so many different provisions and exceptions under the ADA. So don't be surprised if an answer to a question starts with "it depends," because like I said, the ADA is not one size fits all. It's very much case by case. And so talking a little more about the titles or the sections of the ADA. Your entity may have obligations under multiple titles based on who you serve and where you receive funding from, etc. So Title I is designed to help people with disabilities access the same employment opportunities and benefits available to people without disabilities. And Title I is regulated and enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. And most employers with 15 or more employees, as well as state and local governments of any size, must comply with the Title I requirements. Now, Title II of the ADA prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in all programs, activities, and services of public entities. So it applies to all state and local governments, their departments and agencies, and other instrumentalities or special purpose districts of state and local governments, again, also called public entities. This title is regulated and enforced by the US Department of Justice. And then we have Title III. So this title prohibits private places of public accommodation from discriminating against individuals with disabilities. So examples of public accommodations could include privately owned, leased, or operated facilities such as hotels, restaurants, retail merchants, doctors' offices, golf courses, private schools, daycare centers. The list goes on. And it applies to both for-profit and nonprofit businesses and commercial facilities. And Title III is also regulated and enforced by the US Department of Justice. Title IV covers telecommunications, and Title V is the miscellaneous section. So it just kind of has all those miscellaneous provisions under there. We're not going to focus too much on Titles 4 and 5 today. We're going to be focusing more on Titles 1, 2, and 3, as those are probably the titles where you will have requirements or responsibilities. So you're probably wondering, who has rights under the ADA? Who is given rights to equal opportunity and equal access under the ADA? So to be protected under the ADA, a person must be a qualified individual with a disability. This means that they have a disability as defined by the ADA, and the definition is as follows. So it's important to remember that in the context of the ADA, disability has a legal definition rather than a medical one. So because it has a legal definition, it's different. It's going to be different from how disability is defined under some other laws like Social Security, disability related benefits, and more. And when the law was first passed, lawyers really tried to narrow down who had a disability and who didn't, because after all, you can't be sued if you can prove that the person, suing you doesn't actually have a disability. So then later on, the ADAAA was passed because Congress wanted to clarify that the purpose of the ADA is not to narrow down and nitpick who is disabled and who isn't, but rather the purpose is to make sure that people are not being discriminated against. So because of that, the ADA's definition of disability is very broad because, again, disability is so broad, everyone experiences disability differently. People may even experience disability differently depending on the day or the hour. And so you can't have an exhaustive list of what qualifies as a disability and what doesn't, because disability is so broad. And because of that, the ADA's definition of disability is broad as well. So the ADA's definition of disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The ADA also prohibits discrimination against those with a record of such an impairment and those regarded as having such an impairment. And we'll break this down a little further. So impairment can include physical conditions such as diabetes. It could include intellectual or cognitive conditions such as dyslexia or autism. It could include psychiatric conditions such as depression or anxiety, sensory conditions such as being deaf or blind, and many, many others. So again, there's no exhaustive list under the ADA of what is a disability and what is not. Those were just a few examples I just named. Now, there are some things it does not include. So the ADA's definition of disability does not include simple physical characteristics. It doesn't include normal deviations in height, weight, or strength. It doesn't include common personality traits. It doesn't include environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantages. And there's also certain sexual and behavioral disorders that are specified as not being included as a disability under the ADA, such as, but not limited to, compulsive gambling, kleptomania, and pyromania. An impairment is a disability if it substantially limits an ability of an individual to perform a major life activity as compared to most people in the general population. So to be considered a disability, an impairment does not have to prevent or severely or significantly restrict the individual from performing a major life activity. A disability could also be considered a disability even if it's episodic, like epilepsy, for example. Someone with epilepsy may not be substantially limited constantly, but when they have episodic seizures, they are substantially limited, which would still qualify as a disability under the ADA. The comparison of an individual's performance of a major life activity to performance of the same major life activity by most people in the general population usually will not require specific scientific, medical, or statistical analysis, but rather it's really usually more up to common sense analysis for determining whether or not someone has a disability. And the determination of whether an impairment substantially limits a major life activity should be made without regard to the positive effects of mitigating measures. So for example, let's say someone has depression and they take medication that alleviates the negative symptoms of their depression. Even though they take that medicine that alleviates those symptoms, they could still be considered a person with a disability. Now, the only exception, and of course there's always an exception, is eyeglasses. So although the ADA generally requires that the positive effects of mitigating measures be ignored in assessing whether someone has a disability or not, the law also requires that you have to consider the positive effects of mitigating measures of glasses. So if the use of ordinary glasses or lenses results in no substantial limitation to a major life activity, then the person's vision impairment does not constitute a disability under the first part of the ADA's definition of disability. So that's just kind of the exception there. And a major life activity is something that most people in the general population can perform with little or no difficulty. So these can include, but are not limited to, working, speaking, breathing, doing manual tasks, walking, seeing, self-care, hearing, and learning. And major bodily functions are also included in major life activities. So that could include normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, endocrine, reproductive functions, again, just to name a few. And an impairment that substantially limits one major life activity does not need to limit other major life activities to be considered a substantially limiting impairment. So in other words, someone could be limited in one major life activity and still be considered a person with a disability. And the ADA protects individuals with disabilities from retaliation for and interference in exercising their rights under Titles 1, 2, and 3 of the law. So retaliation and interference are distinct forms of discrimination under the ADA, and people with disabilities have the right to be free from retaliation and interference in addition to other rights under the law. So when an individual exercises their rights under the ADA, those are protected actions. So for example, let's say that someone requests a reasonable accommodation and then they're then terminated for requesting the reasonable accommodation. That would be considered an ADA violation because them requesting a reasonable accommodation was a protected action. So if an employer were to terminate an employee based on the fact that they exercise their rights under the ADA, that could be a violation of the ADA. Or maybe let's say someone files a complaint to the Department of Justice against an entity, and then the entity retaliates against that individual. Maybe they deny them services in the future because they filed that complaint in the past. That could be an example of retaliation, which is a violation of the ADA. And the association provision of the ADA prohibits discrimination against a person, whether or not he or she or they have a disability, because of their association with a person with a known disability. So for example, let's say an employer finds out that an applicant has a child that has a disability, and they refuse to hire that applicant on the basis of, or on, because of the fact that they have a child with a disability. And maybe the employer assumes, okay, this person has a child with a disability, they're probably going to miss a lot of work to take their child to medical appointments. So they refuse to hire them on that fact. That would be an example of someone being discriminated against because of their association with someone with a known disability, which would be an ADA violation. So this is all to say that the ADA does not just protect people with immediate disabilities, it protects people who may have an association with a person with a disability, and it also protects those who could be discriminated against for having a record or a history of a disability, like someone who had cancer but it's now in remission, or someone who is regarded as having a disability, such as someone who has facial scarring that maybe they're no longer substantially limited, but they're perceived as having a disability, or maybe someone could be perceived as having a disability from a rumor. And now let's just look at the prevalence of disability. So it's estimated by the CDC that 26% of adults in the United States have a disability. It's about 61 million Americans, or you can think of that as about 1 in 4 people in America have a disability. And it's safe to assume that these numbers are actually smaller because some people may not report their identity as disabled. It's also safe to assume that you interact with someone on the day-to-day basis who has a disability, whether or not you know it, because not all disabilities are immediately obvious. And just, to explain this a little bit further, disability is a unique identity because it's one of the only identities that you can acquire at any time through aging or even through an accident. It's the largest minority group in the country and the world, people with disabilities. And like I mentioned, reported numbers are likely lower than reality. So even though those numbers on the last slide, 1 in 4 people in America have disabilities, it's safe to assume that those numbers are actually a lot lower than reality because, like I said, people may not report their identity as disabled because of it may conflict with another identity that they have, or they may be misdiagnosed or disability is underdiagnosed, or people may be hesitant to report their identity because of the stigma. and the stereotypes attached to disability. And that's, part of our mission is to break down those stereotypes and stigma, because really when you think about it, disability can be viewed as a product of an inaccessible world, not individuals' limitations. In other words, instead of expecting people to adapt to an inaccessible world, we should make our environments so that they are accessible to all. So in other words, instead of viewing disability as a product of self, it can be viewed as a product of an inaccessible environment, an inaccessible world, an inaccessible society. And just know that barriers can be much more than physical. Barriers can be attitudinal, like we talked about those stigmas and those stereotypes. So disability knowledge and etiquette, which is exactly what we're engaging in right now, are forms of barrier removal. So we talked about who has rights under the ADA. We talked about who could be considered a person with a disability and could exercise their rights under the ADA, or maybe who could be considered someone who has a record of a disability or is regarded as or has an association with a person with a disability. Now let's talk about who has responsibilities under the ADA. So like I mentioned, employers that have 15 or more employees, including part-time and full-time employees, have responsibilities under the ADA. So again, Title I applies to all private employers with 15 or more employees and state and local governments of any size. Title I prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in employment. So in other words, you cannot discriminate against someone based on their disability in employment. It applies to all aspects of employment. So the Title I requirements don't just kick in when someone starts working a job. It applies to recruiting, hiring, promotion, training, pay, benefits, and other aspects of employment. And again, this is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. So should you ever have to file a complaint under Title I, or maybe you just need more information about your rights and responsibilities under Title I, the EEOC is going to be the place that is regulating the law in this section. And Title I protects qualified individuals with disabilities in employment. So in this case, the term qualified refers to an individual that satisfies the skill, experience, education, and any other job-related requirements of the position sought or held. So the individual must be able to perform the essential job functions with or without reasonable accommodations. Oh, and I skipped ahead. Let's see here. So there are two key factors to determine qualified. So you can kind of ask these two questions. Does the individual meet the necessary prerequisites? And can the individual perform the essential job functions with or without reasonable accommodation? So this is really just to say that the ADA is not affirmative action. It's not an entitlement program. Under Title I of the ADA, it specifies that employees must still be qualified to be hired, but you cannot refuse to hire a qualified applicant because they have a disability. So in other words, it's not saying that you must hire people with disabilities, but Title I is saying that you cannot refuse to hire a qualified individual on the basis of their disability. And essential functions are defined as job duties that are fundamental to the position. So they're the reason the job exists. So for example, if a person is hired to proofread documents, the ability to proofread accurately is an essential function because this is the reason the position exists. So someone must still be able to proofread these documents with or without a reasonable accommodation. And reasonable accommodations are adjustments to or modifications provided by an employer to enable people with disabilities to enjoy equal employment opportunities. So depending on the needs of the individual applicant or employee, accommodations can vary. And examples of accommodations could be a flexible work schedule, changing the environment, or providing an employee with specialized hardware or software to be able to do their job. Reasonable accommodation does not mean an employer is required to lower production quality or production standards to make an accommodation. And an employer is also not obligated to provide personal items such as glasses or hearing aids. However, if an employee does request a reasonable accommodation and that employee has a disability, an employer must engage in the interactive process, which is basically just an informal process to make sure that this employee receives a reasonable accommodation to the best of everyone's abilities. Both employers and employees have responsibilities when it comes to reasonable accommodation. So an employee must make their employer aware of their need for an accommodation because of a disability. There's no formal process for disclosure under the ADA, but many organizations have an established reasonable accommodation process to kind of streamline things. So if a disability is not obvious, an employer can request documentation of a disability to verify the need for an accommodation. And the employer and employee should then participate in the interactive process that I mentioned to determine which accommodation is needed and how to implement it. The decision of which accommodation to implement ultimately lies with the employer, but it has to be effective. However, the best practice for employers is to give primary consideration to the accommodation required by the employee, as the person with the disability usually knows what they need. An employer is not required to make a reasonable accommodation if it would impose an undue hardship on the operation of an employer's business. And an undue hardship is action that requires significant difficulty or expense. It also is not required to provide a reasonable accommodation that would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business or services. And I see that a question came into the chat. So, it says, am I right in understanding that Title I does not apply to employers with 14 or fewer employees? This seems very problematic. Are there any protections for people with disabilities applying to working for small businesses? That is a really excellent question. Under the ADA, Title I does apply to employers with 15 or more employees. However, oftentimes there are state and local laws that provide even greater accessibility and even greater provision. So even though the ADA doesn't cover private employers that have 14 or fewer employees, there may be state and local laws that ensure that, these employers that do have less than 15 employees are not discriminating against people with disabilities. So you're exactly right. That could be problematic. And so under the ADA, no employer with 14 or fewer employees is covered, but there may be state or local laws that do cover these small businesses. So that's a great question. So there are some protections out there. Now diving into Title II of the ADA. So again, you may have Title II requirements, and Title II applies to all state and local governments, their departments, and their agencies, aka public entities, prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all programs, activities, and services of public entities. Title II establishes standards for the operation of public transit systems, including commuter and intercity rail, such as Amtrak. And this title is enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice, or the DOJ. So again, if you ever have a question about your responsibilities under Title II, or you would ever need to, escalate a situation to that point of enforcement under Title II, the Department of Justice would be the place to go for that. And then as well as Title III. So Title III applies to all places of public accommodation. Again, this is hotels, restaurants, bars, theaters, basically private places that serve the public. Title III prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in all goods and services of places of public accommodation. A public accommodation can be broadly defined as most businesses or buildings that offer certain goods or services to the general public, both for-profit and nonprofit, again, are covered. And again, this is going to also, like Title II, be enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice, or the DOJ. So let's just first look at what are the general responsibilities of these public and private entities that provide these services to the public. So the general responsibilities are to provide individuals with disabilities the same opportunities as are provided to all other individuals. Special programs are permissible when necessary, but cannot be used to exclude people from regular programs. So the example I always use for this is, let's say we have a museum that falls under Title III of the ADA. They may initiate a special program where blind individuals are able to come and touch the exhibits, and that creates that greater accessibility. But let's say a blind person just wants to participate in a normal tour or a typical tour where everyone else is not allowed to touch. Just because you have that special program available, you're not allowed to exclude people with disabilities if they want to participate in the typical programs. And general responsibilities continued. So covered entities may not impose eligibility criteria that either screen out or tend to screen out persons with disabilities unless it can show that such requirements are necessary. Entities may not make unnecessary inquiries into the existence of a disability. And although compliance may result in some additional cost, entities may not place a surcharge on only individuals with disabilities or groups of individuals with disabilities to cover these expenses. So let's say your entity needs to install a ramp for greater accessibility. You then could not leave it up to your patrons with disabilities to pay for this ramp by imposing surcharges on them. Surcharges may not be placed only on individuals with disabilities or groups of individuals with disabilities. Now let's talk about reasonable modification. So the term reasonable modification is used in Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA. And a reasonable modification is any change in the policy, practice, or procedure of an entity that's done to offer equal access and equal opportunity for a person with a disability. So there are limits on these changes, and that's where the term reasonable comes in. So entities do not have to make reasonable modifications that would result in a fundamental alteration. So again, what is a fundamental alteration? It would be a change that's so significant to a policy, practice, or procedure that it would change the nature of what is offered. So an example I always like to use of this is, let's say you have a cat cafe. And this is a cafe where people can come get food and drinks, and there are a bunch of cats roaming around. And yes, these places do exist. And let's say someone with a disability wants to bring their service dog. Normally, service dogs would be allowed in cafes. However, this could be a fundamental alteration because the essential nature of the business is that it's a cat cafe. There's cats roaming around. Let's say these cats are known to be startled and spooked by dogs. Well, a person with a disability bringing their dog into this cafe could result in a fundamental alteration, even though otherwise in a typical cafe, it probably wouldn't. It's important to remember that the ADA sets the minimum standards. So like I talked about earlier in response to this question, ADA compliance is doing the bare minimum. So you're doing just enough to pass when you're complying with the ADA. We like to say it's like getting a D in the class, right? You're getting just enough to pass, but you can always do more to get that A. And so entities always have the ability and the right to go even above and beyond what the ADA requires to create even greater accessibility. So like I said, there may be state and local laws that provide even greater accessibility than the ADA, such as a law that would ensure non-discrimination for small businesses with 14 or fewer employees. So just some examples of reasonable accommodations that you may see commonly. A reasonable modification may be, again, permitting a service animal to go where the public may go in a building, even though pets or emotional support animals are not generally allowed. And another example may be accepting proof of identification outside of a driver's license, because not all people with disabilities have driver's licenses. So requiring that someone has to prove their identity with a driver's license could be discriminatory. Another reasonable modification could be modifying a no outside food or drink policy for someone who needs to have certain kinds of foods or drinks, or needs to, has a specific diet because of their disability. So again, these could all be examples of reasonable modifications that you may put into place to ensure non-discrimination and equal opportunity for people with disabilities. So just a quick note on the difference between reasonable accommodations versus reasonable modifications. lots of times people will use these words interchangeably, and just know that when people do use them interchangeably, they may be trying to achieve what the other means. But I just always kind of like to put a note in here. When it comes to the ADA and ADA terminology, reasonable accommodations usually means changes you make for prospective or current employees with disabilities, whereas reasonable modifications usually refer to changes you make for patrons with disabilities. So just a little bit of a difference there, but oftentimes people will use the word reasonable accommodation when they're referring to a reasonable modification for a patron. And now let's talk about effective communication. So covered entities also have the requirement to provide effective communication to people with disabilities. So many people have disabilities that affect their hearing, seeing, speaking, reading, writing, and generally communicating. So Title II and III entities have the obligation to make sure that the information they are putting out is as clear and understandable to people with disabilities as it is for people without disabilities. Now, again, there are some exceptions to this, which would be fundamental alteration or undue burden. Again, undue burden would be significant difficulty or expense. So an example of effective communication could be, let's say you have someone coming in for a very critical, important appointment with you, and that person is deaf and they communicate primarily through American Sign Language, and they request a sign language interpreter. Providing effective communication could be ensuring that you are providing that sign language interpreter or another means of communication so long as it is effective. And Title II entities are required to give primary consideration to the effective communication that is requested by the individual. So in this case, you'd want to give primary consideration to how do we get a sign language interpreter. Title III entities are not required to give that primary consideration, but they are encouraged to do so. But at the end of the day, the important thing is you just want to ensure that effective communication is taking place, however that may look. Now, again, there may be some instances where it may be too costly and you are not able to afford it under any circumstances. If that's the case, you should still try to provide some form of communication that is affordable and would not result in a fundamental alteration or undue burden. And we'll talk more about accessible communication in our upcoming sessions as well. And so finally, how do I ensure physical accessibility, and what are the standards and requirements of physical accessibility under the ADA? So the ADA has what are called the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. They were published on September 15th, 2010 by the Department of Justice. They're often called the 2010 standards or the ADA standards or even just the standards. And what it is you can kind of think of it as a manual, albeit a very long, very technical manual that set the minimum requirements for qualifying facilities to be readily achievable to and usable by individuals with disabilities. So again, you can kind of think of it as the manual that sets the architectural requirements for facilities to be accessible. But again, I highlight the words minimum requirements because it sets the minimum standards. So even if you're in full ADA compliance, you can always go above and beyond to make sure that your facility is even more accessible than what the ADA requires. These standards were studied and scrutinized by the U.S. Access Board prior to adoption, so they're not random. And the standards do not serve as building code, but rather as a physical representation of civil rights. And where do the standards apply? When do you have to follow the standards? So the standards apply with new construction. If new construction is taking place, it should really comply with the 2010 standards to a T because it's new construction. And so it has the ability to, comply with the standards in that design and building. It also applies to alterations of existing facilities. So if you're altering your facility, those alterations should include the ADA standards to the maximum extent technically feasible. So sometimes it's not full compliance is not always feasible when it comes to alterations. Let's say maybe there's a load-bearing pillar that can't be moved. You just want to make sure that compliance is taking place to the maximum extent technically feasible. Also, it applies to existing facilities. So facilities that are not being altered, that are not being updated, that are not under construction. So the responsibilities for Title II and III entities are a little bit different when it comes to what your existing facilities need to comply to, and I'll explain that. So Title II entities have the responsibility of program access, which means a state or local government agency, also known as a public entity, may not deny the benefits of its programs, activities, and services to individuals with disabilities because its facilities are physically inaccessible. So it has to make sure that its programs are accessible. So let's say a program is taking place in a building that is inaccessible. Maybe a Title II entity has to move that program to another building that is accessible to ensure that that program is accessible to patrons with disabilities. So program access can take many, many shapes or forms. Again, it could look like moving a program. It could look like updating or renovating a facility, but the bottom line is that programs have to be accessible, and you cannot deny the benefits of programs, activities, and services because of an inaccessible facility. Now, Title II, I would say that the standards here are they're not quite the same as program accessibility. So Title III entities have the requirement of readily achievable barrier removal. And what that means is that existing public accommodations are required to remove barriers only when it is readily achievable to do so. So readily achievable means easily accomplishable and able to be carried out without much difficulty or expense. So again, if there's a building that's existed, maybe it predates the ADA and it's a Title III building, then that building, or the people who occupy that building, are only required to remove physical barriers when it's readily achievable to do so. Now, again, you can always go above and beyond. So maybe something isn't readily achievable, but you decide that it's important, and you can always choose to make your facility as accessible as possible. In fact, it's encouraged. But under the ADA, these are the minimum requirements. And something I always like to note is good access is good business. So if you are taking those steps to go above and beyond to provide that greater accessibility, that's going to bring you more business. That's going to be noticed and appreciated by people with disabilities, and it's going to benefit you in the long term more than just being known as an accessible place. It's going to benefit your business, your prosperity. So the ADA was signed in 1990. We saw the first iterations of the standards in 1991, and then the second, now currently enforceable standards in 2010, which I've been talking about for the past several minutes. Many facilities have been around a long time. So let's say a building was constructed before the 2010 standards were published, or even before the 1991 standards were published, or even before the ADA was signed into law in 1990. Let's say we have a building that was built in 1983. Does that building still need to adhere to the standards? Yes. Older buildings do have to follow the standards. So facilities that fall under Title II or Title III of the ADA should follow the standards no matter when they were built. Now, there is a safe harbor provision. So any elements, and elements are pretty much just pieces of a building. Elements could be a water fountain in a building, or a bathroom, or an accessible route. So any elements built or altered before March 15th, 2012, which was that date that the 2010 standards became enforceable. So any elements built or altered to comply with the 1991 standards, the first iteration of the standards that was published after the ADA was signed into law, do not need to be changed to meet the 2010 standards until alterations or updates of that element occur. So, let's say that we have a building that was built in 1983. And then the ADA was signed into law in 1990. And then the first iteration of the physical accessibility standards under the ADA was published in 1991. Let's say that this building that was built in 1983 was updated in 1992 to comply with those 1991 standards that were written into law. So this building's already been renovated to comply with those first iterations of the standards. The ADA says that that building does not have to be renovated again to come up to compliance with the second iteration of the standards, the 2010 standards. And really that safe harbor provision is there to ensure that you're not punishing people who once did the work to come up to that ADA compliance, or you're not making people do more work or go through a second set of renovations when they already went through renovations to comply with the first iteration of the standards. However, once alterations take place on a building, then those alterations should include being brought up to the 2010 compliance. But really the big takeaway here is that grandfathering is not an existent concept under the ADA. So even if your facility was built before the ADA was signed into law, it doesn't mean it's grandfathered in. Grandfathering is not an existent concept under the ADA. And so I could talk on and on about the standards. We could probably be here all week talking about the standards, but if you want to know more about the dimensional requirements, those specific requirements under the ADA to ensure physical accessibility, how wide do my parking spaces need to be? How high do the grab bars in my bathrooms need to be on the wall? How many water fountains do I need to have? And what are reach ranges? And what makes something a protruding object and not for a person who is blind? All of these questions are answered in the 2010 standards. So where can you access these? The U.S. Access Board has a very user-friendly online version of the standards that includes hyperlinks to the other sections that are referenced. So using this online version, it's really easy to jump around to the different sections referenced. The U.S. Access Board also has a guide to the 2010 accessibility standards. So in addition to explaining the requirements of the standards, this guide provides clearly labeled recommendations for best practices that exceed the minimum standards. So again, that go above and beyond. And the guide also provides links to other federal accessibility requirements that also may apply to entities covered by the ADA. And you can also go to ada.gov to find the standards just in their purest form as published by the Department of Justice. The New England ADA Center also produced a checklist that provides just kind of a very user-friendly way to go check according to the standards. And again, this is a really useful tool for checking the compliance of your facility without having to jump back and forth between all the different tricky sections of the standards. We also have hard copies of the 2010 standards in our online store. And finally, if you want to learn more about the standards and what they say and the major requirements, we have an online course. We offer a free self-paced online course, like I mentioned in our catalog earlier, all about the 2010 ADA standards. So all of these are referenced in the slides, and all of these links are live links that are included in the slides. And I'll say on top of all of this, if you ever have a question about the compliance of your environment, your space, your building, call your ADA center and they'll be able to work through it with you. Because I know some of this can be overwhelming, confusing, and also remember that ADA compliance does not take place overnight. Incremental changes go a long way. So one step at a time, but just know that your ADA centers are here to assist should you have those questions about, hey, I'm not sure if my bathroom is ADA compliant or not. Here's what we have. Can you tell me how this relates to the standards? That's what our technical assistance service is for. So that is all the information I have for you today, but I just want to go ahead and look ahead to our training calendar. So today we talked about the ADA overview and basic legal obligations. On March 15th, we'll talk about accessible communication in the ADA. On April 12th, we'll talk about disability etiquette and inclusion. And then on May 17th, we'll talk about emergency preparedness and the ADA. And so with that, I want to go ahead and, as promised, put our contact information back on screen. And I want to open the floor for any questions you may have.